For years, the royal vault remained a sacred and sealed chamber beneath Windsor Castle, its treasures untouched until now. But when Camilla attempted to gain access, she was met with a shocking roadblock, a quiet yet unyielding voice, Lady Louise. What followed wasn't just a rejection, it was the beginning of a rebellion that would shake the foundations of the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It all began with a request, a formal one, wrapped in the pretense of duty. Queen Camilla, now emboldened by her position and increasingly confident in her royal influence, discreetly commissioned a private assessment of select items within the royal vault. She framed it as a matter of transparency, heritage, and legacy preservation. But behind palace doors, the whispers told a different story. This wasn't about preservation. It was about power control over the symbols of monarchy that were never truly hers to begin with. And at the center of this vault, both literally and symbolically, sat the one thing Camilla couldn't touch: Queen Elizabeth's personal jewelry archive. The vault itself is no ordinary chamber. Nestled deep below Windsor, its reinforced steel doors protect not just crown jewels, but untold heirlooms, tokens of monarchs past, gifted treasures from foreign dignitaries, and personal items Elizabeth held close to her heart. The security surrounding it is legendary. Only a select few have ever had full access, and even fewer know the full extent of what lies inside. That list of individuals used to be topped by the Queen herself until her passing. Now, surprisingly, the name most whispered in relation to the vault isn't Charles or Camilla. It's Lady Louise Windsor. This quiet, often overlooked granddaughter of the Queen had always existed in the margins of royal attention. Yet, unbeknownst to many, she had spent years growing closer to her grandmother. After Prince Philip's death, she often accompanied the Queen on quiet walks, late rides, and secluded moments at Balmoral moments, when the monarch's guard was down and her heart was open. According to multiple palace insiders, it was during these moments that the Queen saw in Louise something she hadn't seen in others: a stillness, a sense of honor, and most importantly, a resistance to the seduction of power. And so, in the final months of her reign, Queen Elizabeth made a decision that shocked even her closest aides. She handed Louise the symbolic key to the vault. This key, a small ornate artifact with a lineage of its own, was never formally declared. It wasn't listed in any will, but its presence in Louise's possession, entrusted during a private, undocumented moment between grandmother and granddaughter, now stood as a direct counter to Camilla's ambitions. When the request came from Clarence House for vault access, Louise didn't respond through a statement or an interview. She replied the only way the Queen would have wanted: through action. She simply refused. Palace corridors, once silent, buzzed with disbelief. For all her newfound status, Camilla was denied by someone with no title, no seat of power, just the Queen's quiet favor. Some staff reported an eerie calm in Louise's demeanor, a sense of resolve not born from entitlement, but from sacred duty. And within hours, the leak happened. A single line, whispered to the press: Lady Louise has declined the Queen Consort's request to access the royal vault. The implications were immediate. What had been a private gesture was now a public defiance. Camilla's camp scrambled, furious, blindsided. Charles, sources say, remained notably silent, unwilling to publicly challenge the Queen's granddaughter or confront what his mother might have truly intended. The royal vault, once untouched, now became the center of a silent storm, and Lady Louise stood at the heart of it, unmoved, unyielding, and unmistakably in control. But as whispers of Louise's refusal echo through the palace halls, few realize this is no isolated defiance. It's the first move in a long simmering war for control over the Queen's legacy. Behind palace gates, the Queen shared more than smiles with her granddaughter. Louise, she shared secrets. And in the final year of her life, Her Majesty passed on something more valuable than any tiara: her confidence. What did the Queen whisper to Lady Louise, and why did she choose her above all others? After Prince Philip's passing, Queen Elizabeth found herself surrounded by tradition, obligation, and the ever-thinning air of trust. The royal court was growing colder, more transactional, but within that storm, there was one presence that remained untouched by politics, untouched by ambition: Lady Louise. Unlike the others who angled for titles or influence, Louise offered something far rarer: silence, loyalty. A soul untouched by royal scheming. It was during those quiet mornings at Balmoral, when grief still lingered in the Queen's breath, that Louise began to emerge not merely as a granddaughter, but as something far more profound: her chosen reflection. The Queen, once so guarded, began to open up in ways no one expected. They rode horses through mist-draped fields, exchanged letters written in coded affection, and shared thoughts unspoken in council chambers. Those around them took little notice until it was too late. Palace staff began noticing that Her Majesty took a particular comfort in Louise's presence, often inviting her into rooms typically reserved for senior royals. According to one footman, the Queen once referred to Louise as her mirror in another age, not because of resemblance, but because of spirit unshaken, quiet, yet deeply observant. In the Queen's final year, these moments intensified. She began to subtly guide Louise through the heritage of the family, not the politics. It was as if she were passing on not a legacy of rule, but a legacy of restraint. While others measured royalty in jewels and scepters, the Queen seemed to be preparing Louise to protect the soul of the monarchy itself. And the centerpiece of that soul, the royal vault, was no longer just a chamber of treasures. It became a symbol of trust. In a hushed and undocumented moment during one of their final afternoons together, the Queen presented Louise with an object no one else knew existed: a tiny, gilded box containing a key. But it wasn't just a key to metal and stone. It was a message, a sacred handover. There were no formal declarations, no audience, no ceremony. Just two women, one legacy, and the quiet promise that what must be protected would never be sold, never be displayed, and never be disgraced. That act, that silent exchange, changed everything. Louise now carried not only the Queen's key, but the Queen's quiet instruction, and, as the Queen's health waned, Louise began to see the shadows closing in. She noticed the soft yet persistent inquiries from Camilla's aides about the family jewels. She saw the shifting glances between advisors who had once stood neutral. She read the tension in Charles's eyes when he realized something had been kept from him. The fractures within the family weren't just political, they were personal. Some sought to preserve memory. Others sought to reshape it. Louise, still young, still silent, now stood at a dangerous intersection. Yet, while Louise inherited the Queen's trust, another woman believed she inherited her power, and she wasn't about to let a quiet 20-something stand in her way. Clarence House was meant to be a sanctuary for royalty, but on that day, it turned into a battlefield. Sources confirm Camilla summoned Lady Louise for a private discussion, but what unfolded was far from polite. And once Louise left, the Queen Consort knew something terrifying. She had no control. It began as a quiet meeting request, no formal summons, no written invitation, just a verbal message sent through a royal aide. Lady Louise, still reeling from the emotional weight of her grandmother's legacy, was not prepared for the coldly calculated tone Camilla would adopt behind those closed doors. This was not a meeting. It was a confrontation. Camilla, leaning fully into her self-ordained role as Queen Consort, came armed not with affection or familial warmth, but with legal arguments, historic precedent, and the assumption of obedience. She asserted her queenly rights, a phrase she repeated with unsettling confidence, insisting that full access to the royal vault was now under her jurisdiction. It was, she claimed, her right to determine which jewels should be preserved, displayed, or even quietly sold. What followed was a moment that sent tremors through the palace. Camilla handed Louise a document, an inventory request. A full accounting of every piece, unused since 1953. The implication was chilling. The Queen's private heirlooms were being categorized for disposal. Louise, often seen as quiet and reserved, finally spoke with steel in her voice. She looked the Queen Consort in the eye and uttered the words that would echo across royal walls. "These pieces are not for sale, not for show, and they were never meant to leave her care. The temperature in the room plummeted. A silence fell not from uncertainty, but from disbelief. Camilla hadn't anticipated resistance, certainly not from Louise. The exchange only escalated from there. Voices were raised. Camilla demanded to know who, in this new era of reign, speaks for the Queen. And Louise, without flinching, replied, "The one she trusted before she left." The words, spoken without anger or arrogance, struck like lightning. The truth was unspoken but undeniable. Queen Elizabeth had left behind more than a legacy. She had left behind a chosen protector, and that protector was not sitting on any throne. She was standing across from it, unbending. And while this clash might have stayed buried within palace walls, someone somewhere leaked it. Just days later, whispers reached the media. A quiet rumor turned headline. Vault conflict erupts behind palace doors. No names were confirmed, but the tension was unmistakable. And Charles? He did what he has mastered over decades. He stayed silent, neither defending Camilla nor challenging Louise. That silence in itself deepened the divide. For the first time since the Queen's passing, it became clear. There was no single voice guiding the monarchy anymore. There were factions, and this wasn't just about diamonds or crowns. It was about who truly carries the Queen's will forward. But what Camilla didn't know was that Louise wasn't standing alone, and behind her was a silent alliance built on something far more enduring than titles: loyalty. Buried within legal language and centuries of royal tradition, one clause in the Queen's sealed will has surfaced, and it changes everything. It didn't name a crown wearer or a title holder, it named a protector. And to Camilla's dismay, it wasn't her. The revelation came not through a grand announcement or press release, but through hushed voices echoing within the palace walls. The Queen's will, kept sealed for reasons rooted in tradition and secrecy, was finally accessed by a select circle of royal legal advisors. What they found was not a reshuffling of titles or estates, but a clause so precise and so deliberate that it sent ripples across the firm. Within the tightly drafted paragraph, tucked away beneath ceremonial language and historical precedent, was a directive from Queen Elizabeth that no item classified as a private historic heirloom of sentimental and sovereign value was to today, to be liquidated or removed from royal protection under any circumstance. These were not crown jewels on public record. These were her personal treasures, objects never loaned, never exhibited, never touched without her consent, and she had named only one person to guard them, Lady Louise Windsor. The clause was worded in a manner that made legal interpretation nearly impossible to challenge. It granted no ownership, only custodianship. Louise was declared symbolic custodian of the personal royal archive of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, a title with no previous precedent, and one that had no royal salary, no official crest, and no press announcement. But within the private corridors of power, it was a nuclear strike. In one stroke, Camilla's assumed authority over the royal vault had been legally neutralized. She could not authorize appraisals. She could not select items for exhibitions. She could not under any circumstances order anything to be sold, gifted, or loaned. All such authority now rested with Louise, who, by this legal clause, stood outside the hierarchy of rank. She was not acting as the king's niece, she was acting as the Queen's shield. King Charles, upon learning of this clause, reportedly sat in stunned silence. Sources close to the palace say he had been kept entirely in the dark about this particular arrangement. Camilla's frustration, however, was far less muted. She believed the will would affirm her status, solidify her control over the legacy of Elizabeth II, and put an end to the vault standoff. Instead, she found herself sidelined by the very document she had hoped would empower her. The clause, so specific in tone, seemed to echo a deeper sentiment, one that many had quietly suspected for years. That the Queen, despite public appearances, harbored quiet concerns about the direction the monarchy might take after her passing. Even Prince William and Prince Edward, both close to Louise in different ways, were caught off guard. The family's internal balance had shifted. What was once an informal standoff had now become a legal reality. Camilla could not challenge it publicly without appearing to defy the Queen's last wishes. But in private, tensions began to boil. Advisors whispered that the Queen had foreseen this clash long before her final breath, that she had anticipated ambition would try to claw at sentiment, and power would try to rewrite history. And so, she left behind a guardian, quiet, unnoticed, but immovable. But as legal bindings stoke quiet fury, the real shock came not from a will, but from a safe, and the single note left inside. In a vault lined with treasures of immeasurable worth, it was a slip of handwritten paper that carried the most weight. Her Majesty's final message wasn't meant for public eyes, but now it echoes through every corridor of Windsor, and its meaning, devastating. Tucked inside a small trinket box nestled in the deepest chamber of the royal vault, a folded note lay hidden beneath an old sapphire brooch and a pair of Queen Mary's discarded gloves. It wasn't labelled, dated, or sealed, but its presence struck with a force no jewel could match. When Lady Louise discovered it alone, away from press, lawyers, or ceremony, what she read shattered her. Not everything that shines is gold. Some shine through truth. 9 simple words, yet they pierced through centuries of tradition, vanity, and ambition. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but it didn't need to be. Louise knew. The handwriting was unmistakable, and the meaning was hauntingly clear. This wasn't just a final thought, it was a warning, a message to the future, a shield against those who might dare distort the past. The note spread not through official channels, but through whispered recounting. Only a handful saw it, and even fewer understood its depth. But to those closest to the Queen's final days, its intent was unmistakable. It was a veiled instruction, a rebuke cloaked in grace. Some shine through truth. In those words, many saw a direct counter to what the monarchy had slowly become in the public's eye, more spectacle than substance. And for Camilla, who had spent months quietly maneuvering to place herself at the center of Elizabeth's legacy, the note's appearance was a seismic threat. Her team, upon hearing of its contents, reportedly moved quickly to downplay its relevance. Some claimed it was a personal musing, others suggested it was never meant to be found. But the truth was already loose, and the symbolism was too powerful to be silenced. Louise, overwhelmed and shaken, reportedly broke down in private. For all her composure, that moment confirmed something she had quietly feared. This battle for the vault wasn't just about jewels or titles. It was about legacy. And she had just been given the heaviest burden of all. The Queen had entrusted her with not just the key, but the conscience. Not power, but truth. Not authority, but responsibility. The note transformed Louise from a quiet defender to a visible threat. And Camilla knew it. Suddenly, every public appearance, every interview, every curated moment of royal unity was cast under a new shadow. Because within that shadow, a quiet rebellion had begun, not with protests or headlines, but with principle. It didn't wear a crown. It didn't need a title. It lived in the silence between words, in the courage of restraint, in the decision not to give in when the world expected compliance. The Queen's last words weren't meant for applause. They were meant to remind one person, Louise, that truth has always shone brighter than any crown. While the note was deeply personal, its discovery stirred something greater, a quiet rebellion forming beneath the marble floors of tradition. In the shadow of royal decorum, unexpected loyalties began to form. Behind Camilla's back, a silent alliance emerged, and its members weren't commoners. They were born of the crown, and for the first time, Camilla faced a force she couldn't charm nor command. While Camilla rallied her advisors behind the scenes, preparing to reassert her control over the Queen's legacy, something far more dangerous than resistance was taking shape: solidarity. It didn't begin with grand declarations or public gestures. It began in hushed conversations, exchanged glances, and quiet refusals. During a tense family gathering at Sandringham, Princess Anne broke her silence. Known for her stoicism and detachment from palace politics, she turned toward Louise and simply said, You've shown more spine than most with titles." Those words, spoken in front of senior royals, did more than validate Louise. They shifted the balance of power. Anne, the no-nonsense keeper of royal tradition, had just aligned herself with the granddaughter no one expected to lead. Then came William. Though he remained publicly neutral, behind closed doors, he made it clear he would not intervene against Louise. When Camilla attempted to pull him into her corner, requesting he persuade Louise to allow limited access to certain heirlooms, William reportedly declined. He knew the Queen's trust in Louise had been absolute, and while he didn't voice open support, his refusal to pressure her spoke volumes. That subtle but powerful act deepened the cracks in Camilla's strategy. She was now surrounded by silence where she had expected obedience. Caught between this growing division was Sophie, Countess of Wessex. As Louise's mother and Camilla's daughter-in-law by marriage, she found herself emotionally torn. Insiders suggest Sophie attempted to mediate behind the scenes, pleading for calm, while privately admitting that her daughter's resolve had shaken the entire house. Her voice, once a calming force within the firm, was now trembling under the weight of two women she loved, and the storm neither was willing to retreat from. The cracks widened as royal courtiers, usually faceless and voiceless, began to leak strategic pieces of information to the press. Carefully chosen words, planted in briefings and whispered to long-time royal correspondents, painted a picture of Camilla as overreaching and Louise as the rightful protector of Elizabeth's legacy. These weren't rebellious staffers, these were veterans of the Queen's reign, men and women who had once served her with unwavering loyalty, now acting as silent defenders of her final wishes. And then came the most unexpected intervention. The Queen's former personal secretary, a man rarely seen or heard since her funeral, reportedly sent a discreet message to King Charles himself. The message was clear. If you push Louise any further, you risk dishonoring your mother's final instruction. The impact was immediate. Charles grew quieter, more withdrawn from the conflict. Camilla, increasingly isolated, realized that the monarchy she thought she could shape in her own image was slipping further from her grasp. But while Louise had unexpected allies, Camilla wasn't done. She had one final, desperate plan to reclaim what she believed was hers. In a stunning twist, Camilla launched a new royal exhibition featuring select crown jewels without consulting the vault's custodian. But the move backfired spectacularly. What was meant to showcase legacy instead exposed a betrayal that could never be polished away. It began as a whisper in the museum world, an exclusive showcase titled The Royal Jewels Retrospective. Invitations were drafted, exhibition layouts finalized, and headlines prepared to glorify Camilla's curation of the monarchy's most priceless artifacts. The announcement came without warning, catching both press and palace aides off guard. But what no one expected, what Camilla deliberately concealed, was that among the selected pieces were items unmistakably tied to Queen Elizabeth's private collection. Some were duplicates created as ceremonial backups, others were undisclosed gifts the late Queen had quietly safeguarded. None of them were cleared by Lady Louise, and none of them should have seen daylight. To the public, it appeared glamorous at first, an opportunity to see the legacy of a monarch through jewels and gems. But to those familiar with the inner workings of the royal vault, the exhibition wasn't an homage, it was a breach. When Louise learned of it, not from family but through an aide's whispered confession, the betrayal was complete. With the stroke of a pen, Camilla had attempted to rewrite the boundaries of the Queen's final wishes, bypassing the very custodian entrusted to protect them. But Louise didn't stay silent. For the first time since the vault conflict began, she went public. In a rare and forceful move, a formal memo was distributed to royal staff and leaked within hours. In it, Louise expressed deep sorrow and opposition to the unauthorized use of items tied to the Queen's personal archive. "These were never meant to be paraded," she wrote. "They are not ornaments of nostalgia, they are symbols of trust." Her words hit like thunder, and the reaction was immediate. Online, the fury exploded. "The Queen's memory is not for sale," began trending worldwide. Journalists pounced. Commentators questioned whether Camilla had finally overreached beyond repair. What was meant to be a celebration of monarchy had become a full-blown crisis. Then came the second blow. Another leak this time, from within the family itself. An internal memo surfaced, showing Louise's emotional objection to the exhibition weeks before its launch. She had warned senior royals that pushing forward would fracture public trust and disrespect the Queen's personal safeguards. Yet her words were ignored. The document ignited even greater outrage. Camilla's defenders went silent. The museum, under pressure from sponsors and fearing reputational damage, cancelled the exhibition quietly within weeks. Camilla's silence afterward was deafening. She vanished from public engagements. Her allies in the firm distanced themselves. The Queen Consort, who once commanded press attention, now found herself the subject of subtle isolation. Meanwhile, Louise, without demanding the spotlight, had defended the very soul of her grandmother's legacy, not through power plays, but through integrity. And the public saw it. As public support swelled behind Louise, a final twist in the Vault saga threatened to expose the truth behind the Queen's deepest fears. Just when the drama seemed to reach its peak, Lady Louise made one last discovery. A second vault, deeper, older, unmarked. Inside, not just jewelry, but relics, photographs, and writings that told a different story of the monarchy. A story some never wanted told. It began with a chain, an old locket Louise had worn since the Queen's passing. Few paid it any attention, assuming it was sentimental, perhaps a keepsake from Balmoral. But what no one realized was that inside that locket lay a hidden key delicately shaped, unlike any other in the royal collection. It wasn't until Louise, alone and grieving after the exhibition scandal, began to explore the furthest corners of the royal vault that the key revealed its true purpose. Behind a heavy false panel, concealed beneath antique trunks and forgotten ceremonial robes, lay a second door, smaller, colder, untouched for decades. When Louise inserted the key, the lock clicked with the unmistakable sound of something ancient yielding not to power, but to trust. Inside, time stood still. Dust-covered ledgers, handwritten letters, and locked diaries formed a library of truths long hidden from the public, and perhaps even from the crown. There were photographs never released. Louise, as a child, sitting beside the Queen with an expression of wonder in her eyes, not yet aware of the significance she would one day carry. Personal notes Elizabeth had written in the margins of speeches, underlining words like duty, dignity, and most hauntingly, deception. And then, laid carefully atop a velvet cloth, was a jewelry set unlike any Louise had seen. Not catalogued, not listed in any known royal inventory. These weren't for display or inheritance. They had been left untouched, unclaimed, clearly labelled with a line written in the Queen's familiar hand, "For the one who walks without hunger for power." Nowhere in this deeper vault was there any mention of Camilla. Not a photograph, not a letter, not a passing reference. It was as if the Queen had crafted this final space as a sanctuary preserved not for successors of title, but for successors of spirit. Louise stood alone in that chamber, surrounded by silent echoes of a monarch who had planned for a future most never foresaw. She didn't speak about what she found. She didn't parade it to the public or use it to strike back. Instead, she did the unthinkable. She sealed it. Personally, with new security measures, sworn confidantes, and her quiet vow that the contents would never be used for politics or spectacle. To some in the palace, this move was baffling. To others, it was confirmation of what they had come to believe all along, that Louise wasn't defending the monarchy's image, but its essence. She had been given not just the Queen's treasures, but her final truths. And now, she alone carried the burden of keeping them from being twisted. Camilla's absence from this vault was more than symbolic. It was a revelation, one that validated every decision Louise had made. And so, with truths unearthed and alliances redrawn, the final blow came not from the vault, but from a royal decree issued behind closed doors. It didn't come in the form of headlines or handshakes, but in a sealed royal document. King Charles signed it in private. Camilla was no longer to act on matters related to the royal vault. The Queen's legacy now had a new guardian, and her name was Louise. The decision was swift but silent. After months of tension, defiance, and an escalating public narrative that left the monarchy teetering between tradition and turmoil, King Charles made a choice, not guided by politics, but by preservation. He issued a formal acknowledgement of Lady Louise's custodianship over Queen Elizabeth's private heirloom archive. The decree, simple in its wording yet monumental in impact, effectively stripped Camilla of any authority related to the royal vault and its contents. It was not punishment. It was protection. A final act to seal the Queen's wishes in stone and end the chaos that had come dangerously close to tarnishing her memory. Camilla received the verdict in silence. No public statement, no appearance, no rebuttal. For weeks, she retreated from the spotlight, cancelling engagements and reducing her public role to near invisibility. Sources close to Clarence's house admitted privately that the blow had been deeply personal. She had fought for recognition, for place, for legacy, but in the end, it was given to another someone without a crown, without a title, without any expectation of power. And perhaps that was precisely why the Queen had chosen her. Louise, unshaken, stepped into her role not with celebration, but with quiet purpose. There was no coronation, no grand announcement. Instead, she began the work of safeguarding history, organizing, archiving, and curating parts of the collection meant not for vanity, but for education and remembrance. Plans were quietly approved for future heritage displays, carefully chosen items to be shared with the next generation, not for glamour, but for meaning. She understood what her grandmother wanted. Not a spectacle, but a legacy carried with reverence. The media responded with awe. Headlines across the globe hailed Louise as the keeper of the Queen's soul. Commentators praised her restraint, her strength, and most of all, her refusal to be drawn into royal theatrics. The public, weary of opulence and scandal, found in her a symbol of grace. She was young, but she had proven something that others, despite decades of experience, could not: that true power doesn't need to be flaunted to be felt. And then came the moment that brought it all full circle. Early one morning, far from the eyes of the press, Louise was seen walking quietly past the vault. The key hung from a thin chain around her neck, just like the locket once had. She paused, glanced at the sealed door, then kept walking. The message was clear. The future isn't in what's locked away. It's in how you choose to protect it. And while one vault closed, another opened a future where legacy is protected not by crown or title, but by quiet strength and unwavering loyalty. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.